After discovering an old voicemail on his phone that he never listened to, left by a woman he once loved and lost years ago, Mark finds himself unable to delete it or play it again, because in that single unread message exists an entire version of his life that never happened, and he sits on the edge of his bed staring at the screen, feeling a strange tension between curiosity and fear, realizing that some memories hurt not because they are painful, but because they represent choices that can no longer be undone. And as he finally presses play, her voice sounds softer than he remembered. Not dramatic, not emotional, just tired and honest, saying she hopes he is well and that she only wanted to say goodbye properly. And in that moment, he feels a quiet collapse inside himself. Not grief, but recognition. The understanding that closure does not come from answers, it comes from timing. And timing is the one thing humans never control. And he reflects on how many moments in his life he postponed emotionally, believing he would return to them later, believing feelings could be paused like tasks. And now he sees how silence can be more final than any argument, how absence can replace meaning. And he realizes that the most painful losses are not people, but versions of ourselves that never got the chance to exist. And as he deletes the voicemail without replaying it, he finally accepts that some stories are not meant to be completed. They are meant to teach us how to live with unanswered questions. And in that acceptance, Mark feels something close to peace, not because the past is resolved, but because he is no longer trying to rewrite it. A few days later, Ryan meets an old friend by accident in a small grocery store, someone he hasn't seen since they were teenagers, and the conversation starts awkwardly, with simple questions about work, family, and life in general. But beneath those polite words, he feels a quiet tension, because this person represents a version of himself that never left, never escaped, never questioned everything so deeply. And as they talk, Ryan realizes that his friend does not seem unhappy, not trapped, not disappointed, just spokojno żywe. And this realization unsettles him more than any criticism ever could, because it challenges the story he told himself for years, that leaving was necessary to grow, that staying meant failure. And now he sees that growth is not always about distance or ambition. Sometimes it is about learning how to accept the life you have without constantly comparing it to the life you imagined. And as he walks home after that meeting, he feels a strange mix of humility and relief, understanding that his journey was not wrong, but neither was the life he left behind. And for the first time, he stops judging his past choices as mistakes, seeing them instead as steps in a longer process of self-understanding that has no clear destination, only deeper awareness. That evening, Ryan sits alone in his childhood room, the same room that once felt too small for his dreams, too quiet for his ambitions, and now feels almost chujim, filled with objects that no longer represent who he is, and yet carry an emotional weight he cannot ignore. And as he looks around, he realizes how much of his identity was built in opposition to this place, how strongly he defined himself by what he wanted to escape rather than what he actually wanted to become. And this realization creates a subtle internal conflict, because he understands that even after years away, this environment still shapes his emotional responses, his sense of belonging, his hidden fears of stagnation and irrelevance. And he reflects on how often he chased change as a solution to internal discomfort, believing that new cities, new people, new experiences would automatically transform him into someone more fulfilled, more confident, more complete. And now, sitting here again, he sees how that belief was partly an illusion, because although his внешняя жизнь changed many times, his internal patterns remained surprisingly consistent. The same doubts, the same restlessness, the same quiet feeling that something is always missing. And this awareness does not make him regret leaving, but it forces him to acknowledge that self-discovery cannot be outsourced to circumstances. It requires direct confrontation with one's own emotional landscape. And as he lies on the bed where he once imagined his future, he understands that growth is not a straight line away from the past. It is a continuous dialogue with it, an ongoing process of integration rather than escape. And in that understanding, Ryan feels a strange emotional maturity emerging. Not optimism, not disappointment, but a calm acceptance that his life is not defined by where he lives or what he achieved, but by how honestly he relates to himself. And for the first time, he stops asking whether he made the right choices and starts asking a deeper question. Am I finally willing to stay present in my own life without constantly planning to leave it again? The next morning, Ryan takes a long walk through the neighborhood, not with the intention of remembering anything specific, but simply to observe, to move without a destination. And he notices how different this experience feels compared to his younger years, when every step in this area felt like waiting for something better. And now it feels more like listening, like giving the present moment a chance to exist without immediately judging it. And he becomes aware of how his body reacts to familiar places, subtle tension in his shoulders, a quiet alertness in his thoughts, as if part of him still expects to be disappointed. And this bodily memory fascinates him because it shows that experiences are stored not only in stories, but in sensations, in automatic emotional responses that persist long after circumstances change. And he reflects on how often he ignored these internal signals in favor of abstract ideas about success, happiness, and freedom. And now, by simply walking, breathing, and observing, he feels a deeper form of awareness emerging, one that does not seek to categorize experiences as good or bad, but simply allows them to exist. And this non-judgmental presence feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, because it removes the need to constantly define himself through evaluation, through progress, through comparison. And in that discomfort, he senses a subtle shift, the beginning of a different relationship with his own life, one based not on escape or ambition, but on attention, patience, and emotional honesty. And as he returns home, he realizes that this walk did not change anything externally, but it altered the way he inhabits his internal world. And that change feels more significant than any relocation he ever made. Later that day, Ryan sits with his parents at the kitchen table, a place that once symbolized routine and limitation, and now feels strangely grounding. And he notices how their conversations revolve around small, repetitive details: weather, neighbors, health, daily tasks, topics he once dismissed as insignificant, yet he now senses a quiet depth in this simplicity, an emotional continuity that exists independently of ambition or achievement. And as he listens, he becomes aware of how rarely he allowed himself to value stability without labeling it as stagnation, how often he associated meaning with intensity, movement, and visible progress. And this realization creates a gentle internal conflict, because he can see that fulfillment does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it exists in consistency, in presence, in relationships that endure without needing reinvention. And he reflects on how his parents never left this place, not because they lacked imagination, but because they found enough meaning within its boundaries. And this challenges his long-held belief that staying equals settling, because now he sees that staying can also mean choosing to invest emotionally in what already exists, rather than constantly searching for something better. And this perspective does not invalidate his journey, but it reframes it, allowing him to see his past decisions not as necessary escapes, but as stages in learning how to recognize value without external validation. And in this reframing, Ryan feels a quiet respect for both the life he left and the life he built, understanding that neither was wrong. They were simply different expressions of the same desire to feel at home within himself. That evening, Ryan goes to the old park where he used to play as a child, the swings creaking softly in the breeze, the paths lined with trees that have grown taller than he remembers, and he notices how memory and reality collide, how the place feels both familiar and foreign at the same time. And this duality unsettles him because it mirrors the way he has experienced his own life, both continuity and change coexisting uneasily. And as he sits on a bench watching children run past, he recalls his own youthful ambitions, the dreams he carried so fiercely that he believed they would define him forever. And he realizes how much he has let go of those versions of himself, not with regret, but with recognition that some dreams belong to a time and a self that no longer exist. And this recognition opens a new emotional space where he can honor his past desires without being trapped by them. And he reflects on how much energy he wasted resisting reality in favor of imagined possibilities. And now he begins to feel a quiet alignment, a sense that presence and attention are as meaningful as any achievement or escape. And as the sun sets, casting long shadows across the grass, he notices how light and shadow intermingle, just as his past and present interweave within him. And in this awareness, Ryan senses the first genuine moment of internal peace, not because circumstances have changed, but because he has changed the way he inhabits them. On the following morning, Ryan decides to visit the small bookstore where he used to spend hours as a teenager, flipping through pages of novels he would never finish and imagining worlds far larger than his own. And as he walks among the familiar shelves, he notices how time has altered the place. Books replaced, sections reorganized, new owners, different energy, but the smell of paper and the quiet hum of the store remain, anchoring him to memories he once thought unreachable. And he realizes that although the world moves on relentlessly, some spaces retain a kind of continuity, a bridge between who he was and who he has become. And standing there, he becomes aware of how much he has avoided these spaces over the years, fearing that reconnecting with them would remind him of all he hasn't achieved, all the dreams left incomplete. And now he sees that avoidance only prolonged the sense of incompleteness because it kept him from witnessing the ways he had grown despite those gaps. And as he picks up a book he once loved, he feels a subtle emotional shift, a recognition that the passage of time has not erased his passions, only transformed them. And this transformation is not loss, but evolution. And as he leaves the store with the book tucked under his arm, Ryan feels a gentle but profound connection to his own life, and understanding that reconciliation with the past does not require perfect outcomes, only awareness, and that living fully is not about escaping history, but about inhabiting it with honesty and presence. Later that afternoon, Ryan sits on a bench by the river, watching the water flow steadily past, reflecting sunlight in a way that reminds him of how time moves relentlessly yet quietly. And he notices how differently he experiences this familiar view now, how it no longer feels like a backdrop for longing or escape, but like a mirror for his own inner state. And as he observes the ripples, he realizes that his past anxieties, his fears of stagnation and missed opportunities, were like eddies in the water, temporary disturbances that seemed significant at the moment, but ultimately part of a larger, steady current. And this recognition brings a sense of calm he has rarely felt, because he sees that life's flow is not measured by milestones or achievements, but by the continuous, often unnoticed process of being present. And as he sits quietly, letting the breeze brush against his face, he reflects on how much he has learned to value patience, observation, and acceptance over action, control, and comparison. And he understands that the peace he feels is not the absence of desire or ambition, but the presence of awareness, a conscious choice to inhabit each moment fully without being consumed by what is missing or what might have been. And in this stillness, Ryan finally senses that he can move forward not by running toward the future, but by walking steadily with himself, fully attentive to both his past and his present. That evening, Ryan returns to his apartment and sits by the window, looking out at the city lights that blur softly in the twilight, and he notices how quiet the streets feel compared to the constant internal noise he carried for decades. And he reflects on the unexpected weight of memory, how some experiences linger not as stories, but as subtle emotional imprints that shape decisions, perceptions, and self-judgment. And he realizes that the disquiet he has felt all these years was not about failure or loss, but about not fully inhabiting the life he had while chasing the life he imagined. And as he watches people moving through their ordinary routines, he feels a strange mixture of envy, admiration, and recognition, because they too carry invisible histories, unnoticed struggles, and quiet victories. And this realization softens his perspective, allowing him to feel compassion for both himself and the world. And he begins to understand that personal growth is rarely dramatic or visible. It happens quietly, in the small moments of observation, reflection, and acceptance. And he remembers the old voicemail, the park, the bookstore, the conversations with his parents, all pieces of a mosaic that now reveals itself as a coherent pattern, not perfect, not idealized, but honest. And he notices how he can finally integrate the past without being trapped by it, how he can allow memories to exist without judgment. And in this awareness, Ryan feels a sense of internal alignment, a quiet clarity that did not exist before, because he recognizes that living fully does not require perfect choices or complete understanding, only presence, attention, and the courage to face oneself. And as the night deepens and city lights shimmer against the dark river of streets, he allows himself to simply breathe, to feel, to exist without performance. And in that stillness, he finally experiences a profound sense of peace, not as a conclusion, but as an opening, a readiness to continue moving through life with honesty, awareness, and acceptance of all that he was, is, and will become. The next morning, Ryan wakes early and sits quietly at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, noticing the way sunlight falls across the room and illuminates dust motes floating in the air. And he realizes that this simple observation feels more alive than any major event in recent memory, because for the first time, he is not rushing toward something or trying to fix anything. He is simply present, and presence feels unfamiliar yet grounding. And as he reflects on the past weeks, the walks through his old neighborhood, the bookstore visit, the river, reconnecting with his parents, the silent evenings of thought, he begins to see a pattern emerging, a subtle but undeniable sense of coherence between past, present, and self. And he understands that the life he has lived, with its mistakes, absences, and missed opportunities, has not been wasted, but has quietly prepared him to inhabit this moment fully. And in this inhabiting, he discovers an unexpected freedom, a freedom not born from achievement, adventure, or escape, but from the acceptance of reality as it is. And he notices that old regrets and anxieties no longer dominate his awareness. Instead, they exist like gentle ripples in a pond, acknowledged but not controlling. And he realizes that his identity is not a fixed structure, but a living, evolving relationship with experience, thought, and feeling, and that he can choose to meet each day with curiosity, patience, and honesty rather than fear or avoidance. And as he takes another sip of coffee, Ryan feels a profound sense of alignment, as if decades of internal tension are finally settling, and he allows himself to feel fully alive, not because the world has changed, but because he has changed his relationship to it. Understanding at last that life's meaning is not found in grand gestures or perfect decisions, but in the quiet, deliberate practice of noticing, reflecting, and being present. And in this stillness, he finally experiences a peace that is not passive or empty, but rich, grounding, and enduring, a readiness to continue forward with awareness, integrity, and acceptance of both the life he has lived and the life he has yet to live.